So there's three classes, at least, of ways that you can test functional design hypotheses. One is by coming up with a peculiar prediction about what the morphology or the shape of the machine should be if it really is optimized for that.
Yeah.
And that's usually working on, and so that's usually a very nice pointy prediction, because if it has that weird peculiar morphology, it could only really be for that. Another way is behavioral. You could just ask whether the animal uses it behaviorally in a good way. Like let me give you an example, the pruny fingers. So why do we get pruny fingers? Why do your fingers get pruny and wrinkly when you get wet? And so our hypothesis 8-something years ago was that, in fact, this is not some automatic side effect of wrinkling. In fact, we know it's not an automatic side effect of wrinkling. Turns out that when you get a nerve cut to your arm, the sympathetic nerve is damaged. You no longer get pruny fingers when you get wet. And doctors noticed this in 1920, so that if a car accident victim comes and is unconscious and they're injured and they want to know whether there's a nerve cut or not, they would just stick their fingers in warm water and see whether the fingers wrinkle. But even still to this day, it's still in Wikipedia that it's because of osmosis or something.
Yeah, that's what I learned. Yeah.
So, but the three different ways to test it. One is to say, well, what would the optimal shape wrinkles be? What is actually the best kind of rain treads? And you can actually mathematically work out what the topology, the topography, and the direction that those channels should be if they really are. And so it's a very peculiar pointy prediction. That was our paper that came out showing that it actually has exactly the kinds of peculiar channels, river-like channels in a particular mathematical sense that you'd expect. But another way is to say behavioral. Does it in fact help? This is like, a couple of labs try to do this, but it would be behavioral, like ideally get a bunch of people doing parkour and they're in wet conditions without pruny fingers, and then in wet conditions with pruny fingers, and then in dry conditions with and without pruny fingers, and like have them do all this kind of dangerous stuff and record the number of injuries and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then so that's more behavior. And the third way would be phylogenetic, or looking across the tree of life, which kinds of animals, certain kinds of animals which tend to be in wet and dewy conditions, and don't have claws like us. Yeah. You can predict certain kinds of animals maybe be more likely to have developed this mechanism because they need them, where certain kinds of other animals wouldn't. So there would be three different classes of ways of going about testing it, and they would have analogies for swinging a toast, for things that you find at Home Depot as well. So they're testable, but you're just a different kind of test. You're not taking typically a piece of meat in the lab and sticking microbes in it. It's usually not that kind of test.
Right. So the Pruney fingers paper, which is how I first became familiar with your work. I think it's so fascinating. Did you go through that all three tests for that particular feature?
For that, our main paper. Our paper that came out was the first of those, the morphology. And so it was working out mathematically what is the optimal morphology, the optimal shape wrinkles. We also did I had 3 or 4 undergraduates at the time that were working on behavioral studies. We had all these different kinds of heavy naturalistic kinds of objects, and then they had to tap, like you would have the subjects had to move them down and then move them up in some kind of pattern. And then there were wet conditions and dry conditions. And the idea was these were heavy and odd shaped, kind of things you just might be grabbing in real life. Maybe even grabbing trees. Ideally, I think it's probably more like your own body weight, like when you're a primate, either walking. When we wear rain treads, it's because it's on our shoes. It's our own body weight. That's why I'm thinking more parkour. Whereas the only studies that have to do, they were dealing like little marbles, grabbing marbles. And it's like, this is not relevant. I don't think it's useful. Yeah. It's actually rain treads, like treads. So there were statistical significance in some of their studies, but they were all undergrad kind of studies that you don't really believe, and I would have wanted to use that as a pilot, but then maybe see if we could do something more serious, and we never did. Yeah. And I'm not really that kind of scientist. I'm good at more theoretically working out what is the optimal mathematical structure, physical mathematical structure, and so that's what the paper was about. But we did begin that, and I tried to do phylogenetic, but no one knows which ones do and which ones don't.
Yeah.
Right. And I wasn't exactly sure which ones should and shouldn't, because I didn't know enough about like which ones are in really, really dry conditions and have been in really, really dry conditions for millions of years. So I didn't really know how to do it, but I had contacted 20 different labs and said, do your primates get Pruney because you have a particular species? And they're like, heck if I know, we'll call you back if we find out. But so. Yeah. Macaques, there's those Japanese macaques that are always taking the baths or whatever. You can see I scoured hundreds of those pictures and finally I could find some where you could see their pruny fingers.
Sure.
So that's in the paper, but
That's where I imagine that feature would be most useful is when you're, like I'm thinking like walking across a river with slippery rocks or climbing a log that's wet or something like that, where having that little extra grip would really pay off.
But just think about when all of your shoes have rain treads. I mean, all of your shoes have some kind of tread, and it's not because you're walking over a stream. It's really just because it's dewy or rainy quite often in your life, and so I also want to stay clear from primates or apes in water, because there's the other whole, humans became special because we were the water ape. And
yes, I've heard that.
People then say, it's because you thought we were water ape. No, it's just we're all wearing train treads now. It's not because we think we're the weird water ape. Stop it.